First, I want to mention about Brian's comment about the older people coming. They're right around the corner, and we need to get ready for that because they're coming. Well, Amy said so. Refer to the same thing. When I wake up in the morning, I look over and I find I've been sleeping with an older person. And if I open my eyes and look in the mirror, I see that I'm one. Most of the people I talk to during the course of a day are also older people. I'm wondering, how will I notice when all these other legions come and join me? You know, given my life, one of the few places that I can identify and meet and see what Amy was talking about was the need for intergenerational relationships is at church. It's really one of the very few places that this is possible. And frankly, I miss that. I truly miss that. And my church, as good as it is, I think doesn't do all it can. My wife perhaps misses that intergenerational contact more than I do. But listen to, remember what Amy said. She didn't just say intergenerational. She said intergenerational relationships. And that, to me, changes everything. Dick Van Corp is a really good friend of mine. I've known him for about a year. He's 95, and about 2 months ago, he got a bicycle. And he started riding his bicycle, and he said, this isn't so easy. He said, after all, he said, I haven't ridden a bicycle since I've been 91. Dick is a good friend of mine. We have a good relationship in a year. I think of the words passion and purpose that you want. Dick is passionate about being against the war. He was a conscientious objector in World War II. At 95, that's a possibility. And he still is passionate about it. His purpose, and we talk all the time. We send email. I mean, he's a great on the internet, and we send emails all the time. And it's not as though I'm not anti-war myself, but I don't have his passion for it, and he's always trying to make a difference for me. And bring to my attention articles. We have a great relationship. I really like that man, and I think that's important. And it isn't just because of who he is, it's because of our relationship. Rich, Bimler and I have known each other for a long time. We haven't met for a long time, but Rich and I have been friends for, when was that? About 35 years ago, you invited my colleague, Howard Thorsheim, and I from St. Olaf, to do some projects with some youth ministry he was working on. And I was impressed that he understood what it was that we were doing, because we had sometimes a hard time figuring out ourselves what was the essence of what we were doing. But anyway, I thought about Rich over time because I appreciated his ability to understand what was going on. I have a question, Rich. Now you're not doing youth work per se like you were. What's the difference do you see in doing what you were doing when you were doing with us and what you're doing now with Wheat Ridge, or were with Wheat Ridge and so forth? What's the main difference?
Hey, thanks. By the way, the year was 1850 when we were together last time. It's interesting, Bruce, you think about that. The people I'm working with now, older adults, were the young people 50 years ago, and the Lord's given me another chance with them. But I think I think there's a lot of similarities between older adults and young people too, in terms of stereotyping, grouping them. But the thing that sticks out in my mind, it is a relational thing. You develop relationships one-to-one, older adults with younger people and so forth. And even though we haven't been together a long time, it's still that relationship, I think, that really helps. So really good to be with you again. Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. I appreciate it. It's good to be with you. Is anybody here that spent some time in California, lived in California for a while? Raise your hands. Where from? Whereabouts?
In Los Angeles area.
Okay, how about closer to the Bay Area? Anybody close to, whereabouts? Oh, I'm sorry? San Francisco, of course. Okay, what's your first name?
Cornelia, but I go by Ellen.
Alan, okay. I grew up in Berkeley, and in my day, I'm sorry to say this, but San Francisco, we refer to it as Frisco. I don't do that anymore. Never, I promise you, I don't do that. But San Francisco was always, and still is, that sort of jewel in the Bay Area. I liked Berkeley a lot, but I bet we could sit down and find common interests and common things that we've done. How many years did you live in San Francisco?
5 years.
Good. Okay. That would be fun. It would be fun to sit down with you and talk. What I've been talking about so far, because I'm going to get to some really concrete things. That's what I promised Ozma I would do. Is that the issue isn't that Rich is a really capable person. We didn't talk about his education. We didn't talk about the particular jobs he's had. What was important, at least for me, was our relationship. If I can put it this way, it's kind of hokey. The space between us. You know, and I'm not sure we could do the same thing, but I suspect so. It's not who you were, who you've been, or where I've been, or thing, but it's the space that we would develop between us. You know, and that's a different way of looking at the church and the older people that are in the church. It's not the older people, and it's not the church. It's the space between them. That's what I suggest makes a difference. You know, I say this because my colleague Howard Thorsheim and I have spent about 35 years doing research in this era. It was the kind of thing that spun into Rich's interest in what we were doing. And that's the important thing. And I'll pick up Amy's phrase, a paradigm shift, because I kind of like it. I never know exactly what it is, but I kind of like the term. It's looking at things differently. You don't look at them as this person or that person, but what is the relationship between that person and the person sitting next to them in the pew, or that person and the pastor, or that person and some of the church leaders. That's what makes the difference. It's what some people now call social capital rather than individual capital or human capital. I mean, I'm not going to dwell on that term, but it's a new term, and I just thought I'd impress you by throwing it out. So when we talk about emerging fit, on the right-hand side of your folder, all the way in the back, the very back piece there is sort of a summary of what I'm saying. It's the very last one. The top says emerging fit. The emerging fit that I'm talking about is the emerging fit of our relationships between who I am as a person, a changing person. I'm a changing person. I changed a lot when I retired. I didn't know it at the time, but I really did. And don't think anybody could have told me how I was going to change, but I changed. And the church changes. I mean, part of the stuff I've gotten from a comment I had in the Lutheran magazine a couple of months ago have been mostly on how the church is changing. New music that I don't understand anymore, or new ways of liturgy, or these new people, or what in the world is a drum doing in the sanctuary, or it goes on and on. These have they're always changes. And what do we do about that? What is the relationship between ourselves, and I mean here the other older people in church, and the church, and the younger people, the intergenerational connections that Amy was talking about? Within the last 8 weeks, as an example, both my wife and I have found out that we have cancer together. I don't recommend that kind of togetherness. How will that change us? I don't know. But how will that change us in a relationship with our relationship in the church? I don't know that either, but I know there are always bumps and changes going on in our lives and in the life of the church. And that's what I want to speak to. It's important, and I want to speak to all older adults. It is really easy when we look around a church and say, oh, well, we have a lot of older people working. I mean, look, John is on the church board, and Betty, why, she's head of this particular group, and Martha is head of one of the circles, and you can name, maybe a dozen people that are older who are active in church. Well, then you can say, well, how many older people do you have in your church? 100. Well, how about those others? The people that are shyer, that don't respond just because you put up a notice saying that older people are invited to do stuff. And I'm serious about that. That's my passion, is to reach all of them, not just the ones that are already engaged. And what my purpose is in helping older adults is to have a sense of well-being. A church can have an interest in building its size or in its income or whatever. What my interest is the well-being of older people. And that has two components that come right out of research, and it comes out of research consistently. One is to be able to contribute to life in some way that's meaningful to them. Some way to still contribute to life. One of the worst things that can happen to us as we grow older is to be cared for. As if we're invalid or babies. I mean, the picture on the wall of the baby was perfect. But as an older person who may in fact do all those things, they still want to be able to be a contributing member to life in some kind of way. And the second is relationships. To still have meaningful relationships. Those are the two things that when I think about stuff that I think are important. And so that's the purpose. That's my purpose. How do we get there? Well, my colleague and I call it empowerment. That's what we called it initially when Rich and I got together years ago and did it with youth, and we still call it empowerment. I don't really like the term a lot because it's kind of jargony, but it means the relationship between people so that they're both helped in finding a way to have some sense of well-being. I'm going to tell you 6 stories. I'm going to use stories because I think they're easier to remember than facts. One of them And they're on the sheet that I passed out. So if you want to get the names down, you can see that. And I call it a Fitters Empowering Toolkit. I don't know, it's kind of a hokey name. But anyway, if we're gonna make older people in a church fit together, regardless of the changes in their life as things go along, whether it's music or illness or death of a spouse or whatever, these are things that can make a difference. First one I call is giving by receiving. I mean, I love that phrase. It's one of my favorites, giving by receiving, and I think it's really true. I began since the days that Dan was one of my students years ago at St. Olaf. I was more into community and social psych then. I've been reading more in neuroscience, and I'm finding it fascinating because they support a lot of the old things that you learned about social psych and community psych in your day. So neuroscience really supports the idea that those of us who give gain more than those who receive. If that's so, why aren't we helping more people to give? If it's better to give than receive, which is part of the church's teachings, why aren't we helping all older adults to find a way to give? My best story from this, and I've told it over and over again, and it's as old as hell, because actually I keep referring back to our work with you, Rich. You really made an impact. But I remember one of our first sessions that we had for Rich's group was in Houston, and during the program, in a recess, a black pastor came up to us and started talking to us, and he said, let me tell you a story. He said, I have a black congregation, and he said, we're pretty poor in the inner city. And he said, one day a lady came from a suburban congregation, and she said, the women of our church have gotten together, and we'd like to be helpful to the women in your church. We'd like to bring clothes to you that we don't use anymore, or would find it helpful if you had them, coats, shoes for your children. And the black pastor said, well, sure, let me ask the women. So we went back, and they said, sure, that would be very nice. They would appreciate that. And so they began doing that, and it worked out well. And the women in the black congregation, inner city congregation, wrote thank you notes back to the women in the suburbs, and all went very well. But then the women in the inner city congregations thought, we'd really like to do something back for the women of that church. And so they asked their pastor if their pastor would speak to the women in the suburban church what it was that they could do that would be helpful in return. And the pastor asked the women, and you can guess what I'm going to say. The women in the suburban church said they couldn't think of anything that the inner city women could do for them. Now, there's a second part of the story that could be the end of it, but there's an interesting second part of the story. What the inner city women decided to do, interestingly, was continue to accept the clothes, but not write thank you notes anymore. And pretty soon, the suburban women got upset. Why aren't we being appreciated for all that we're doing for these women in the inner city? And so pretty soon, they were the ones who stopped the program. Now, I like that story especially because thank you notes, thank yous of all kinds, are a form of relationships. They truly are a form of a relationship. And they are a form that enables us to understand that what we do is appreciated. That's one. That's my first story. Second story is Ask and Listen, and the title is a veterans program that could but didn't, because it's so typical of what happens for a lot of in our congregations. This is in my congregation, and it was just 2 months ago. One of the members of the congregation, who is a veteran, as I am, decided to have a program and have all the older veterans in the program in the church come to a program, and he had arranged that five speakers. And I went, and I wasn't one of the speakers, which was fine, but I've got some great war stories to tell. and I was kind of anticipating that. And after the 5 speakers were over, then the person who was in charge says, "Thank you all for coming. We'll see you in church." And I was just listening to myself, and I was really disappointed. I had a story to tell too, and in my town anyway, there are very, very few veterans. We have 2 colleges, Carleton, St. Olaf, and there isn't a lot of veterans, or at least if there are, they don't get together very much. And so I went home not being able to tell my story. I had nothing to contribute in that program, as much as I appreciated it. Third story, walk with. My wife, Jan, is a terrific person, but she doesn't feel like she's a public speaker. She's rather reluctant to get up in front of groups and talk. But she was talking with one of our church leaders one day, just chit-chatting, like you do in the halls after the service. And they were talking about moving into it. Jan and I, my wife and I, had moved into an over 55 condominium a number of years ago. And Jan was sort of talking if that was a good thing or wasn't a good thing. It was a question: when do you move, when don't you move? And the church leader happened to pick up, this is a good topic. This is an important topic for people who are retired. It isn't just what you do, it's when you do it. So she said, "Well, Jan, why don't you we'll have a program between the services and you could talk sometime." Well, Jan said, I don't speak. So rather than drop it, the church person said, "I'll work with you." I'm not sure if she said, "I'll walk with you" or not, but that's what she did. She walked with Jan, encouraged her, helped her what to say, listened to her, sort of rehearsed what she was going to do, stood next to her when Jan gave the program at church. And it worked out terrific. Jan was pleased, the participants were pleased. Now, one reason I tell this story is because this is a leadership development program. One of the things that I think is very clear about what we're all trying to do is that it somehow has to depend on the pastors doing more than they're already doing. And if they think they've got to do it all themselves, they're never going to do it. They may not even want to listen to us because they're afraid they're going to have to do it all themselves. Well, here's one way to get somebody else to help who's an older adult who doesn't feel they can do it. Walk with them for a while, and you'll have a new leader to be able to help you carry out this program. I feel very strong. Leadership is was my dissertation topic, and I feel very strongly about this as being an important part of it. Teaching isn't just for the kids anymore. And the title of this particular story is The Conductor in Our Changing Music. Years ago, when we were changing hymnals, as Lutherans are wont to do now and then, and people were grousing, "Oh no, where's our favorite songs?" Not only will some of our favorite songs be gone, the songs I've sung since I've been 12 years old, But if they're included, they're going to be in a different spot in the book. I mean, what we did was have, in our case, we were lucky. We had the conductor of the St. Olaf Choir, Anton Armstrong, goes to our church. Well, he had a special session between services in which he taught us why they were adding some new songs. He taught us that. The board didn't just say we're going to have a new hymnal or we're going to have some new songs. They went the next step and actually took the idea that you can teach. I'm not going to say old dogs, new tricks, but they could teach us why we were changing hymns. And believe me, that made a huge difference. At that point on, when we heard some of the new hymns, speaking for myself and my friends, we understood why they were doing it. We didn't grouse about it. It almost stopped grousing immediately. Why don't more of our churches think that all they have to do is get the approval of the board to make a change in the church, and everybody else will just follow? I don't understand it. What's happening? What's happened to the idea of teaching? I'm biased, I'm a teacher, but it seems to me that that's still a pretty good method. Church and identity, the last one. A helpful mosaic, a helpful mental mosaic lost, the paradox of size. My church isn't big, but it's grown from about 300 to about 700 over the last 40 years. But when we used to have what we called an adult forum between services, when most of the adult members of the church came to hear a variety of things. Sometimes it would be some of our youth talking, sometimes it would be an outside speaker, sometimes an adult member who had been someplace. But that included us all. And we are all not of one mind, that's for sure. But we all go to Bethel Church, and we all respect that. And out of those adult forums, I had a good sense of our diversity. And that was mentioned by the speakers before, the importance of diversity. It's in us. But I could see it, I could hear it, and I began, and out of that story of who our church was, because those adult forums were truly stories. They were really stories, and those were part of who I was. I was a member of Bethel Church, and we had these kinds of people. I wouldn't necessarily agree with all of them, but that's beside the point. As our church got bigger, we got too big to do that. So now we've splintered up into all these little groups. The social justice group, about 2 or 3 Bible groups, a reading group. Those are great groups, each one for itself. But for me, in some sense, they typify what's happening in our country. We're dividing ourselves up into specialized groups, and we no longer have a mosaic of who we are all together. The last one I'm not going to comment on, but it's the easiest. It's in the handout. It's simply called Meeting and Greeting. I asked one of my good friends, Joe Smith, who's retired, what do you want to have happen at church that will make you feel the best sense of well-being? And he just named these 6 things that are in the handout. Greet me, come up, say hello, Joe, which is his name. Hello, Joe, how are you today? Or, hello, Joe, how's that project you were working on, 35 years ago? Or last week when you mentioned it? Or, how's your wife doing? I heard she was sick. Or, remember that project you started back in 30 years ago? I see it's paying. He wants to be recognized as a human being, as existing. If there's a term I've heard most in my reaching out for what it is that's missing in older adults in the church congregation, are 2 words: invisible and insignificant. And we're not asking for the world, we're just asking to be recognized as still existing, contributing, relational human beings. Thank you.